Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Altmed podcast. Your host, Andrew Dowling, here. In the co-host chair is my man, Mitch Kurtz.
Morning.
And we have a special international guest of notoriety today joining us to tell us all about everything that's happening in Canada. Is none other than an author from MJ Biz Daily. It's Matt Lammers. Matt, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's excellent to have you on the show, actually. Very curious to get some insights. We've basically had only Australians to date, a couple internationally, but yeah, very keen to get this discussion underway because obviously Canada is somewhere we look to in Australia as a kind of leading figure in the world for cannabis, I guess.
Kind of like our
most countries
sort of our older brother or something, but yeah, we're just wanting to get a sense of, I don't know, it'd be good to unpack what's gone right, what's gone wrong in Canada, and maybe see if we can spot some of that happening here in Australia. So maybe to kick things off, yeah, how long have you been commentating and observing the Canadian medical cannabis or just cannabis industry?
I joined this company in 2017, and before that, I was living overseas as a journalist, and so I wasn't involved in this industry. I didn't know much about it. I spent the first couple of years when I was reporting on it, learning, interviewing people, and learning myself. 2017, 2018, and it wasn't until around 2019 where I felt I had a pretty good handle on it, where I could share some of my opinions. And that's when I started tracking the amount of space that cannabis producers had bankrolled and established. That's what I spent a couple of years reporting on. 2017, 2018, 2019 that was really the story, was when Canadian companies were raising capital and then spending it on greenhouses. And that's pretty much all they were spending it on, besides executive compensation, executive comp and greenhouses. Yeah. And so a lot of my interviews went like this. I was like interviewing analysts and CEOs, and I was like talking to them on the phone, and I was like, so you're bankrolling enough cultivation capacity to produce 200,000 kilograms of cannabis annually, and 25 of your competitors are doing the same, but the demand in Canada is only going to be about 400,000 or 500,000 kilograms for a couple of years. So how do you square that up? And then they were always like, oh, don't worry, the poor companies are going to die off and the good ones are just going to survive. And for them, it was just easy, but that doesn't happen immediately. That takes years or decades, right? So that's how we got into this jam we're in right now, where we have all these companies with these massive greenhouses all over the world, not just in Canada, financed by Canadian companies, growing way more cannabis than they're ever going to be able to sell. So that's kind of how I started questioning.
I mean, one thing we hear in Australia when similar questions are asked about these huge facilities that are being grown is, there's this talk around, but what about export? We'll be able to ship a lot of Australian flower abroad. Is that something that came up as well, or was in the
always? Yeah. That was their first go-to. It was like, oh, any excess we have, we're going to export.
Yeah. And
I was like, you're going to have a lot of excess though. It's going to be 99% of your production. And so I'm not saying there's not going to be an export industry someday. For years, I've just been saying, like, here's the data, here's the export market right now. The export import market for medical marijuana is extremely, extremely small, even today. 5 years ago, it was almost non-existent.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying this isn't going to develop into a big import-export industry someday. It could be in a couple of years, or it could be in 20 or 30 years, but no one knows, right? So you're building these massive greenhouses. If you're building massive greenhouses expecting to export your excess capacity, then that is an unreasonable risk for investors to take, in my opinion.
Totally. Well, what about so I suppose, that's going back maybe 5 years, and, there's just been this huge expansion in cultivation and manufacturing facilities in Canada, some of which have obviously been supplying companies in Australia. So we have, quite a bit of Canadian flower that's come to our shores. But in terms of their predictions of the competition dying off as they were describing to you, what has the degree of consolidation been like over there? Has there been a lot of the players merging with one another? Have some just completely died off? What can you sort of tell us about that?
There's been major consolidation ever since the day I joined this company 5 years ago, but not even close to enough to, to bring down the number of players. Like I saw a stat a couple days ago, I tweeted it out. I'm just going to guess at the data here, so don't quote me. It was something like, you're talking the number of companies that are selling flower in Canada, dried cannabis, went from 50 to about 150 to like 300, like every year it like doubles. Wow. And that's taken into account in consolidation. Consolidation is happening.
Yeah.
But it's not, you can't consolidate like that hundreds of companies. There's something like 700 licensed producers in Canada right now.
Wow.
And it's just the number just grows. There's consolidation every month, every year. There's always consolidation, but that number, the number of competitors, the number of producers in the country only grows. People love this business, right? Like people are passionate about it. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who are regular people who can get access to a couple $1 million, a few $1 million, which is enough to start a cannabis production company. And they do it because they love the plant and they love the business and they love the industry. And those are generally the type of people that I would fear competing against if I was a large company.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I was like, I have all these hundreds of small competitors who are more passionate than I am about the plant, more knowledgeable about farming, more knowledgeable about their customers than I am as a large producer. These companies are kicking the asses of the big companies.
Yeah, well, that is really interesting because I mean, as a kind of casual lay observer looking at what happened over there before Australia, I think to the best of my knowledge, the first one I became aware of was when I think the private equity firm Privateer started Tilray. What's that, going back 10 years? And to think that there's been hundreds of companies since then, it's a little bit different in Australia because, of course, if you want to, basically be an LP, there's a significant capital expense up front in setting up the facility to meet pharmaceutical grade GMP standards. So I'm just, not to dive too deeply into the regulatory side, but is that what is the case over there, in the sense that are all of those 700 odd LPs, setting up a facility that meets Canadian pharmaceutical level of regs, or is it more that?
No. So yeah, to be a cannabis producer in Canada, you don't necessarily have to be pharma quality production or EU GMP or any of that. You need to be, you need to follow good production practice guidelines, which is much lower than EU GMP. It's not like too low, it's high enough in my opinion, but it's definitely lower than EU GMP. So that just means the entry barrier would be much lower. So if every company had to have EU GMP, then the entry barrier would be too high for most people.
Yeah.
And I'm actually working on a story right now about companies wasting their money on EU GMP, Canadian companies, because I took a look at all of the companies that got EU GMP certifications for facilities in the last 5 years. There's like dozens. Yeah. And how many of those facilities think are even in operation today? Like 4 or 5.
Wow.
Like almost like very few.
Do you think it might be a situation kind of like the beer market, where you have all these little microbreweries type kind of like, these people who are super passionate, as you were saying, small companies that end up getting just bought out by the bigger ones as they hit that kind of medium-sized business?
Maybe, I don't know. The thing is the big companies, eventually, yes, eventually you're right. But the problem is right now is you don't know who the winner is. So you don't know who the big ones are. The big companies that are big today aren't going to be the companies that are big in Canada next year, because they're doing so poorly. So I'll just read off some market share data for you, just to paint a picture of how bad the large producers are doing, okay? So the number one company in Canada by market share is Hexo. 1 year ago today, their market share was 13%. They spent roughly $1 billion on M&A since then. And their market share has fallen to 9.3%. Okay.
Oh my God.
It gets worse, gets way worse. Tilray, which merged with Afria, okay. It's hard to put a dollar figure on that because it was Afria basically reverse acquired Tilray. So it's like, I don't know, they spent a lot of money on that deal. It was, I would say, $1 billion deal, but I don't know the dollar figure offhand. Anyways, their market share 1 year ago was 16.4%. Today, their market share is 8.2%. So it's exactly half. And they spend a lot of money on M&A. Wow. So imagine how bad they would be doing if they didn't spend that money on it. The company wouldn't even exist, right? It would be like probably in the low single digits. Organigram is a company that's an example of what they're doing. They're doing it right. Okay, a year ago their market share was 6%. Today their market share is 8%. They've only spent a little bit of money on M&A, not very much. So that's almost all organic growth. Canopy Growth, who I'm sure you know, their market share was almost 13% 1 year ago. Their market share today is 6.8%. Terrible, disgraceful.
Wow.
It's disgraceful because Canopy alone has spent billions and billions and billions of dollars on M&A, and their market share is only 6.8% and falling fast. And then just like, so the list just goes on from there. So those are the biggest ones, right? And then the smaller companies are improving their market share. But most of these companies aren't profitable, even the smaller ones. And one of the main reasons is Hexo, Tilray, and Canopy. If you look at all the cannabis companies in Canada, those three companies have cut their average cost of cannabis the most in the last 2 years. So they're basically trying to undercut all of the smaller companies. And they're still getting their asses kicked. Canopy and Hexo and Tilray have they sell the cheapest cannabis in Canada. And people still don't want to buy it.
What's the price we're talking about when we're saying the cheapest cannabis in Canada?
I think, I don't have that data in front of me, but I think that it was about $4 to $4.50 per gram on average.
Retail?
Or flour, yeah.
Wow.
So that's really cheap, right?
And people are still not buying it. That's
A lot of people are buying it, but they're buying the other stuff more.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And does that mean
proportionally they're losing sales every quarter.
When those companies though go out and kind of conduct extensive M&A activity, I mean, is that at least is someone winning in the sense of some of those smaller to medium companies that they acquire getting a good payday to to kind of sell up? No,
they lose. You know why? Because imagine exhibit A is Afria buying Tilray, reverse buying Tilray, so it's called Tilray now. And then they closed Tilray's headquarters in British Columbia.
Right.
And that was a pioneering company. You were already talking about Privateer, right? So Privateer started Tilray a long time ago, and they're one of the first licensed producers, very successful, did a lot of research and development. They had a lot to be proud of, that company, Tilray, and they were proud. And then they were bought by Irwin Simon, and then he almost immediately fired everyone at Tilray's headquarters and closed it down, and then gave himself a $10 million cash bonus. These are all just facts. Like anybody can say you're being unfair to them, but these are facts. Is that fair? Is it fair if your company is bought by a large cannabis producer in Canada, and then 2 months later you're unemployed, and the CEO of that company got a $10 million payout?
How does that happen? I mean, we hear about, Constellation kind of CEO fees of, 40, 50, 60 million dollars, things like this. And it seems like that payment was almost just to take them from hemorrhaging $1 billion a year or whatever to only $100 million a year or something like that. And it just doesn't seem right at all.
For normal people like us, it doesn't seem right. But for people who live in that universe, the CEO universe, this is normal. Like CEOs get paid tens of millions of dollars to do M&A in the CEO world, right? So this is just normal. Like this happens every day. But what's different though is that for a couple of years, CEOs in Canada's cannabis industry were the highest paid CEOs in the whole country. and they weren't making any money, and they were firing workers en masse, and they were receiving hundreds of millions of dollars of government subsidies.
Wow.
So that's not normal.
Yeah, it's shocking.
It's great. I mean, just to give sort of our listeners a sense of the executive remuneration at some of the companies that you've mentioned, the big ones, what are these companies on average kind of across the board spending annually on compensating the C-suite?
Well, I'm only talking about the biggest ones, right? Like the Cannabis, the Auroras, the Tilrays, the Hexos of the world. So there's not very many of those. But they pay, usually when the CEO joins the company, they start by getting a massive thank you for joining the company kind of lump sum payment. Sometimes it's all cash. Sometimes it's a combination of cash and shares. Sometimes it's
Is it ever just shares? I mean, I imagine if a company is struggling and you say to someone, hey, welcome to the company, here's a big slice of equity that's not worth very much. I imagine there always needs to be a cash component, right?
They probably, yeah. I mean, they probably would prefer cash, but I've never asked them about that. Even the ones that say, oh, my compensation is mostly share based, so it's not cash based. Even those guys are among the highest paid CEOs in Canada.
Yeah.
But by salary. So, for example, Canopy Growth, David Klein's salary is over $1 million. Erwin Simon for Tilray might be the highest paid CEO in Canada by salary. His salary is, I think, 1.5, 1.6 million. I could be wrong though, so don't quote me on that.
Oh, just salary, you mean?
It's high. It's high.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I mean, is there much talk in Canada about the Australian market? Do you hear about the Australian market much at the moment, or is it kind of like an underling that hasn't really kind of made headline news?
Yeah, not much to be honest with you. It's still pretty small, right? Like, I think you're going to have your sales this year are going to be at $100 million maybe, or maybe 150 million for the whole industry. So that's not that much money. And even in Canada, our medical market is worth about $400 million a year. And that's even the biggest medical market in the whole world. Germany, I mean, there's some issues with German data, so I don't know. I forecasted that Germany would become the biggest medical market in the world this year. So I think that'll probably happen at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's not a lot of talk about the Australian market because it's just so small.
Yeah. And what about then, I want to ask about the, I suppose just, there's a lot of talk in Australia about recreational. We've had a change in government. There seems to be an appetite, at least in some states in the country, to go in this direction. What did you observe to be kind of the impact to the medical market in Canada at the time that Canada opened up a recreational market?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did some reporting on that and about how resilient the Canadian medical market was because sales weren't falling. Medical sales weren't falling after Canada legalized cannabis for a couple of years. But more recently, in the last couple of years, medical sales have fallen substantially. So, and that's consistent with what happens in American states too.
Yeah.
That legalized recreational cannabis, medical sales eventually start to fall significantly. But I mean, when I say significantly, so Canada's medical market peaked at around $550 million annually, the medical market. And now it's, like I said, 400 million. So it's down 25% or so.
Yeah.
But I guess that's going to continue.
Yeah.
Canada has a very unique medical market though, right? It's not, because you can't buy medical cannabis at a store legally in Canada. It has to be mailed to you directly from the licensed producer.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So people who are serious about medical cannabis and they need a lot of it, it's habitual and they stick with that LP because they know what they're going to get from them. They know those products work for their particular issues. And so I think that's why the market's resilient. Canada also has this weird system where the federal government allows people to grow a certain number of plants for either their own medical consumption or designated for someone else. You can designate someone else to grow it for you.
Right.
But we're not talking like 4 or 5 plants here. Like some of these people get dozens to hundreds of plants.
Wow.
And I mean, obviously that's not all for their consumption. So there's a huge gray market that's gray because the federal government permitted them to grow it, but it's not legal because they're not allowed to sell it. You know what I mean?
That is so, because we have one territory in Australia, incidentally, our equivalent to Ottawa. So where all the politicians do their work, and they've permitted, bridge that gap if you please. But basically, they've permitted that particular part of Australia you can grow up to 4 plants there. But hundreds of plants or up to 100 plants is a totally different ballpark, because you can kind of see 4 plants. There's a personal consumption case to be made there, but
we've got LPs doing less than hundreds of plants. Yeah. So it's very interesting.
That is definitely. So what then in terms then of, where the industry is at the moment. So you talked about the medical falling off maybe 25%. What about the recreational market? Is that just going from strength to strength at this point in time?
It's doing okay. So I think the recreational market's going to grow about 20% annually this year over last year. So like the growth is there, and actually the American market is only supposed to grow, like aggregately, is only supposed to grow about 1%. So I wrote a story today about American companies coming to Canada to try and find some growth, which is pretty ironic.
Yeah, totally.
Because Canadian companies are like lining up to try and go to the States, wasting tons of money down there.
Wouldn't the growth of about 1% in America be almost equivalent to about 10% in Canada, though?
I don't have those numbers, but the principle is right.
Yeah.
The principle is right.
Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
How do the Canadians view what's happened in America? I mean, what's your take on your market versus what they do in the US? I'm just curious. Is it totally just uncontrolled, unregulated? Well,
I think it's like controlled and regulated at a state level, but just federally, it's still illegal, right? So I think it's like, and it varies from state to state. Some states are quite strict, and some states it is pretty much a free for all, like in California. So I don't know. The way Canada views the American market is generally it's like a huge bonanza that's just waiting to be tapped. They're like waiting to go down there. But the problem is like the kinds of businesses that I'm talking about are the big ones, right? The cannabis, the distilleries and stuff. But they're so bad at selling cannabis in Canada. So why does anyone think they're going to be any good at it in the States? Or in Germany or anywhere else? Like it does not make any sense. They won't be. Is my opinion.
Are they, and have they set up considerable operation? Have they, in terms of where they spend their billions, have they gone into Europe? What's been the sort of extent of Canadian movement?
Well, okay, first the States. Okay, they have these insane strategies that are ultra risky, like the riskiest business strategies probably ever concocted in anyone's brain. Like so. They put up hundreds of millions of dollars to promise to buy companies after cannabis is not illegal in the US.
Oh shit!
And this happened a number of times. So they'll be like, I don't want to use a specific company because I don't remember the numbers right now, but Cannabis promised to buy company X in Colorado for $250 million and it'll automatically kick in when cannabis is not illegal. So it's risky.
They got the cash left.
Yeah,
it's risk, and they're using cash and stock to do it, to putting money up front, and it's risky, obviously, because you don't know when the U.S. will legalize cannabis. It could happen next week. There was a bill today that went in the Senate. It's not going to pass, but who knows? Maybe it will. The U.S. is super unpredictable.
Totally.
Right. So maybe they're gonna next week. Maybe they're gonna legalize cannabis. Who the hell knows? I seriously doubt it though, and I definitely wouldn't invest $300 million on that prospect.
Why?
I would put maybe $20 on it. I would bet you $20, but I wouldn't put $300 million on it.
Maybe even 50. But
maybe.
But why wouldn't you just go in with that kind of money and on a state by state basis and just set up, cultivate?
So Yeah, great question. They can't because they're publicly traded.
Mm.
So they're on the
illegal
they're
federally.
on the NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange, the Toronto Stock Exchange, and those exchanges won't let cannabis producers who grow and touch cannabis sell cannabis in a place where it's federally illegal.
Yeah.
That's why you see them in Australia.
So the American companies are mostly publicly traded, but they're publicly traded on a small stock exchange in Canada called the Canadian Stock Exchange, and they're cool with that. But it's a very small stock exchange. It doesn't have as much liquidity, and it doesn't carry the weight of the TSX or the NASDAQ or the NYSE.
Surely these companies are just waiting for that day when it gets federally legalized because they think, shit, British American Tobacco, Pfizer, they're going to come in and just purchase us, kind of thing, is what would be in my head, at least.
Yeah, that was part of the hypothesis a few years ago. And that's why a company like Constellation bought Canopy, because they thought the valuations were going to keep rising. There was a bit of a mania happening in 2018, 2019, 2020. Constellation got caught up in it, ended up spending $4 billion to basically buy Canopy Growth. I think they own like 43% or something, with options to buy more. But they basically own Canopy Growth. If they waited a couple of years, they could have bought it for much lower.
Yeah, goodness. And so what are we seeing then in terms of movement into other markets like Europe and Asia? Are any of the Canadians making some big plays there?
So they moved in and then they moved out. So like Canopy and Aurora, and not only, I keep bringing those guys up, but a lot of the other ones too. They bought facilities, they bought greenhouses, they bought companies, they bought property all over the place, like in Denmark and in Portugal and Greece and Germany and Australia, in Thailand, and all over in South.
It's sounding like a land,
even in Africa.
Yeah, just a real estate.
And part of the thesis was that they were going to export it, but again, we already talked about it. Like, there's nowhere to export it to. No one wants to import it. The three biggest import markets in the world are so small.
Yeah,
you have Israel, who has like insanely unpredictable regulations in government. They're changing all the time. They just stopped imports randomly, like earlier this week. I don't know if they restarted them again. So how could you rely on a market like that?
And it's a population of like what, 6 million kind of thing. It's not big.
I don't know what Israel. That's a good question.
It's something like that.
They probably have in between either the second or third biggest medical cannabis population in the world, though. Canada has the biggest. I don't remember, something hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 200,000 people. I don't know. Anyways, Israel is 100,000 people, 110 maybe. Germany, I don't remember what it is, probably 150, just guessing, could be wrong. But so it's a substantial number of potential customers for a business.
And so they've effectively.
What's in Australia too? I was keeping track, but I stopped keeping track a few months ago. So I don't know what you're at now for.
I think it's approaching that, a couple of 100,000.
And it's a bit weird because we have this sort of situation in Australia where, you have regular prescribing doctors, and then you have, other doctors who, get approval for their patient on a kind of per patient case by case basis. And that sort of latter category was the more predominant category early on. So what we were able to track with the data was, okay, this is the number of patients that have been approved on the per patient basis. But now we're seeing that number fall away because more and more doctors are becoming regular prescribers. So the data is a little bit distorted. There's definitely an increase in patient numbers accessing medical cannabis. But
the thing is, we don't have a market other than medical. So even if they're medical or potentially not, every person is considered a medical patient, if that makes sense, in Australia. That's recorded. So unless it's black market, they're all medical. So you could be a recreational consumer who accesses medical cannabis by saying the right things, kind of a little bit like the Canadian model, but you'll be counted as medical data, if that makes sense.
That happens here for sure.
Yeah. And I think we're talking actually before we started rolling about our mutual friend Reese Cohen, and I think some of the the study and research at a place he was formerly involved with it at Sydney Uni, they've sort of indicated that less than 5% of people, of medical cannabis users in Australia, access it legally. So there is a lot of black market CBD oil and all that sort of stuff that people are still accessing. I would expect that the legal medical market is starting to take a little bit more than just 5%, but that's sort of where we're at the moment.
That's what I call the unaddressable market.
Mm.
The number one thing that I've noticed CEOs get wrong in this industry is they take the TAM, the total addressable market, but they include sales in that figure that are not accessible to them.
Yeah.
So it's not addressable. So you can't say it's part of your total addressable market. Keyword is addressable. If you can't sell something to somebody, then you can't say it's addressable.
Yeah.
So you have all these reports coming out saying Europe's total addressable market is X billion dollars. $8 billion, $16 billion, 1 trillion, who knows, like there's a report for every single number you want. If you're a CEO and you're like, oh, I want a report that says the total addressable market is $98 billion in Europe. You can go get one.
Yeah.
There's all this bullshit out there everywhere. But so Europe's sales right now are probably are definitely under $1 billion. It's probably like in between 500 and 700, 800 million dollars. And I'm talking like unlicensed medical marijuana, right? Like medical cannabis with like THC in it, flower or whatever. Like you can get it in oil and all kinds of different formats. But so I'm not talking about like Sativex and all that. I'm talking about medical cannabis that hasn't gone through clinical trials.
Yeah.
Because that's where they see the market. So that's what I report on.
Yeah.
CEOs think that's going to be the massive market. So that's the market I report on. And I'm like, guys, there's almost no market there.
Yeah.
So they build like an 800 or $200 million greenhouse in Denmark. Denmark's sales are so low, I can't even put a number on them. I'm like, it's pathetic.
Yeah. I think one of the LPs in Australia out west might have done some recent activity in Denmark.
One of your biggest companies, what's it called?
Little Green Farm.
Little Green Pharma. They're in Denmark.
Yeah.
But they appear to me to be doing things right in terms of, so they bought Canopy's greenhouse. So basically Canopy, I think it was Canopy, it might have been Aurora. No, it was Canopy. They bought Canopy's greenhouse on the cheap. Canopy paid a lot of money to buy this greenhouse, get it up to speed, get all the stuff in there. And then they didn't know how to make money off of it. And then they sold it to Little Green Pharma, who appears to me to be doing things right by not over-investing and concentrating on sales. And that's what most companies get wrong in this industry.
Yeah,
they don't
totally
concentrate on sales. They concentrate on their story. They concentrate on getting investors hyped up and excited about their stock, but they don't concentrate on where they can actually sell their stuff.
And is that, if you were, having a lot of exposure to the industry, if you were theoretically about to do your own cannabis company, how would you do it differently?
Me?
Yeah.
No one's ever asked me that before. I don't know.
Reverse
to be honest with you,
it.
I'm not enough of a risk taker to start a cannabis company, because all I see is unmet expectations and regulatory development. Your whole business relies on, the foundation of your business is countries creating regulatory pathways for consumers to purchase your products. And that has happened so unbelievably slowly in almost every country.
Yeah.
That I see it as very difficult to make money. So like Mexico was supposed to be the biggest in the world like 2 years ago. It's still not even legal there. All these countries, everywhere it's super slow. In Europe, the biggest risk I see in Europe is all these countries starting trial programs instead of actually legalizing and regulating it. Mm-hmm. And the trial programs, in my opinion, are a waste of time, because you get like, it takes years to get them going, and they get going, and then the total addressable market inside of that trial program, which is the only place you're allowed to legally make money, so it's all a big legal company would care about, is super small, right? So you have like France and Denmark and Ireland has the trial program. All these countries love starting with trial programs. And so that's what I'm afraid Germany is going to do. So they want to legalize cannabis, right? But they have a whole bunch of issues legally in terms of like EU law and the UN stuff. So I'm afraid that they might at some point be like, well, it'll be easier to just start a trial program. Let's just start a trial program. And that would be a disaster.
Yeah.
For big companies.
Yeah. Well, my brother actually lives in twin brother lives in France, and he has sort of been giving me updates, and yeah, he said that it's moving so slowly over there, all of the trial stages. So he thinks it's going to be years before they even have a stable medical market that's accessible to everyone. It's
sure.
Yeah, it's crazy. I have to ask before we wrap up. Do you ever get to do sit down interviews with any of the CEOs of these big companies in Canada? Are you blacklisted because you tell the truth about?
I don't think I'm blacklisted, but I think that I can access them when I need to, if I need to. But I've never interviewed Cannabis CEO.
Yeah.
The thing is at one point CEO turnover was so high. I was like, I'll just interview the next CEO.
Yeah,
you know
what
I mean?
Yeah, totally.
They lost like $5 billion. How much longer can this guy last? I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
And I imagine every time there's a changeover, same type of fluffy announcements, to mark their incoming. I mean, we see a lot of that here in Australia, except it's kind of gotten to the point with, some companies where they will just say something like, company A has announced an intention to have a meeting with company B to possibly talk about doing thing C, like the extent to which these are sort of really just non-committal announcements just to create hype, create value. I mean, I'm sure a lot of those were, cut and paste or copied and pasted from an announcement that you might have seen in Canada. But you would see, are we still seeing a lot of that?
Not as much. I was just going to say, I don't have anywhere to go right now, so I don't have sleep. But yeah, so that was the foundation of the industry in Canada from 2017 to 2020. It was the press release industry, where they didn't concentrate on their sales. They concentrated on the next press release to get investors excited.
Yeah. And
so not less now, because businesses these days, investors are really pissed off because their stocks are down 95% because the companies are hemorrhaging cash and market share. And so now investors are demanding the companies become profitable. Yeah. But when you run a business so poorly for so many years, you can't just turn it around and start being good at what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Especially when you have so much experience of, running it badly and sort of leaning on that experience.
And I don't think anything we're saying here is controversial. These companies have lost $15 billion.
Yeah, that's crazy.
My last question would be, just by the expression on your face, I can see the disenchantment with the cannabis industry from your end. You've seen it all.
I am disenchanted with it because so many investors lost so much money. So many people lost their retirement funds, and because they foolishly invested in ideas instead of businesses. Yeah, and so many people lost time in their careers. I wrote the story, I don't know, a year or two ago, where I looked at, I counted about 21,000 jobs in the cannabis industry in Canada in 2019 or 2020. And then about a year or two after that, there were about 7,000 fewer jobs. So you're talking an extinction level event in the industry, where what other industry on the planet would lose 1/3 of, or more of all of the workers in the space of a year. And how can your business survive? I think that's one story about why they're losing so much money, is that I doubt that people enjoy working there. When you see everyone around you getting canned, you don't start being more productive, right?
Yeah.
If like your colleagues are all getting fired and laid off, you're not like, well, I'm going to start working harder and doing better. You know, you become disgruntled and you slow down.
Yeah. Well, I guess that was the first part of what I was saying, but the second part was, is there any salvaging kind of silver lining to the industry that you see besides all the doomsdaying kind of?
Definitely. Yeah. That's the best question, because legal cannabis, recreation or medical, is good for society because you're taking something that everyone wants that's illegal. A, people aren't going to go to jail for it anymore. And B, people who are doing illegal things, some of those are bad people, biker gangs and whatnot, and they use the profits for bad things. That money goes automatically right to the legal market. So that money is gone for them. Legal cannabis is so good for society. Something like 50,000 Canadians were getting arrested every year, and now it's only for cannabis, and now it's only like 4,000 or 5,000. Still surprisingly high.
Yeah,
but much less than before. So that's the silver lining, is that these large businesses have screwed it up really badly, but legalization on a whole has been very successful in Canada, from like a law enforcement perspective, from a public health perspective. And I think we spent a lot of this time talking about how large businesses are doing things the wrong way, but maybe in the future we can talk about smaller companies and what they're doing right, because I see a lot of small companies, cannabis companies that can't. That's when we started this interview talking about people who are passionate about their businesses and they're bootstrapping and they know the plant and they know their customers, they know what they want. Those are the successful companies in this industry, and those are the ones that are doing very well. Not profitably though, because it's hard for them to make a profit because the large companies are undercutting them on prices so much.
Yeah.
But consumers are still willing to pay more for a good product.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's like, you know, people, I don't know any of my friends who would, you know, other than being out at a bar, buy Johnny Red, let's say, you know what I mean? It's kind of like that kind of thing. And even the cheapest alcohol, the cheapest bottle of wine is not the one you want. Generally speaking, sure, there's a market for it, but
for sure. Yeah.
So I've got time for one more. I'm going to take us back to doomsday, just because that's really the reality of the situation as it currently stands. An article you wrote late last year that just blew my mind, Matt, that I remember reading, was just about the scale of destruction of cannabis in Canada. And it was just kind of along the lines that even when, you know, you set up these huge facilities, you pay people to grow it, all of these things. And
You're reading my mind.
Yeah, man. Well, you know, from an investor's point of view, I mean, you could just imagine how pissed you would be to see that the very thing that's like a beer company, just like, I don't know. What's your... This
is what makes me, this is what makes me a little bit angry. Okay. I'm actually working on an update to that story right now. I just started it like today, literally today. So that's why I said you're reading my mind. I got new data for 2021. So imagine any industry where you're only selling 18% of your production. Do you think that any of those businesses are sustainable? Of course not. No industry can, like, imagine you're a car maker and you're only selling 18% of the cars you're making. What do you do with the rest of them? It's insane. It's so stupid. These people supposedly went to very expensive universities and got very expensive business degrees, but they don't seem to understand supply and demand. I have a degree in economics, but it's not from a good school. Okay, but I understand supply and demand.
Do you reckon you could, you could sell more than 18 cars out of 100?
Oh, guaranteed. I guess at least 40. At least 40.
Especially if you were undercutting the entire market.
Yeah.
But no, seriously though. So like, I calculated my estimate. It could be off by a little bit, but my estimate was that as a whole, the industry only sold 18% of its production from 2018 to 2020. So I got the 2021 data yesterday, and it's worse. Like, it's not better. So in terms of destruction, cannabis companies in Canada have destroyed almost 1,000 kilograms of cannabis since 2018. And so that's 1 million grams, right? So they've destroyed almost 1 million grams of cannabis because they couldn't sell it.
Wow.
And they've sold probably, I'm going to guess, approximately roughly a similar amount. I'm only talking dried cannabis here.
1,000 tons.
And then, but then there's also a huge amount still in their inventories, and that's where the remaining percentage comes from that's unsold. So they're still growing more than they sold. And another thing I want to tell you guys is you got to bug your government about cannabis industry data. I've been able to report on a lot of this stuff because the government collects tons and tons and tons of data from these businesses and publishes most of it publicly. And so I can get these trends, and I can, like, they don't publish the destruction data, but I can email them and ask for it, and they'll give it to me.
Yeah, we're in a similar situation. I think Andrew might be better.
I don't think that your government has nearly as much data as the Canadian government has.
Yeah,
like, we have piles and piles and piles of data for this industry. And that's the biggest problem in this industry outside of Canada right now is you have like Germany and Israel and Australia and Brazil. Probably those are the biggest markets outside of Canada. But the data for those countries is quite pathetic in my opinion, like especially Germany. So, I mean, I think that if without data, you have an information gap that unscrupulous people will take advantage of.
Yeah.
And I see that as an existential threat to businesses and legitimate businesses and the cannabis industry in the next decade. If governments don't release at least as much data as Canada has, proactively, quarterly, then this industry, there could be blowback, serious blowback, and we could end up taking 2 steps back because people might get angry for various reasons that they've lost their money, they've lost their products. You know, why would they support the legal industry if they're getting garbage products and they're losing all of their investments? So I think that those governments, including yours, have to do a lot better.
But equally, you bridge that information gap, and suddenly that's an existential threat to the CEO of a big cannabis company in Australia, because there's a clear pane of glass that allows the public to transparently assess the financial health of that company. But no, thank you, Matt. I'm really so grateful to just a beacon of knowledge and insight on all of these things. And I obviously know that you're an expert at all things Canada, but you seem to be keeping an eye on almost every other jurisdiction around the world as well. So it's been great to kind of discuss global trends and things that are going on outside of Canada too with yourself.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah,
thanks for having me.
No,
thanks,
our
Matt.
pleasure. And we might, who knows, maybe say a year down the track or something, once you get the latest destruction data for 2022, maybe we can circle back and do this again.
Let's talk next week. I'm going to write the story up this week, and then we'll talk about
part 2.
How much cannabis was destroyed? So in 2021, it was about 400,000 kilograms, by the way.
Whoa. Okay.
That's just like one LP's capacity though, isn't it?
Yeah. So, and then you're right. And then they'll stash a lot of their unsold cannabis away. And once you stash it away, it's unsellable because people are still making new product. And so why would anybody want to buy old product when they can buy brand new fresh product? And that's the number one thing that companies get wrong, is that they don't realize they're agricultural businesses.
Yes.
You're not going to buy 1-year-old tomatoes when you can buy fresh tomatoes.
So true.
Need like a cannabis university to send all these executives to for a bit of 101.
Well, they went to like Wharton. They went to like these schools that cost like $100,000 for an MBA, right? But they still don't understand supply and demand. So I don't know what they learned there.
It's a complex topic. actually supply and demand.
Oh, man. Well, on that note, gents, no, appreciate your time so much, Matt. We'll keep in touch and keep doing what you're doing, because we love reading all your articles here.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it. That's nice of you. Thank you.
All right. Till next
Thanks,
time.
Matt.
Take
Until
care.
next time. Bye.
Cheers.